So a little summary of what I'm aiming to offer tonight, and then you can decide whether you wish to tune in or not and when you wish to tune in. I want to talk a bit. I've been doing some work on the gospel and identity politics. So I'm just going to unpack that a little bit. So I want to say a little bit about the contemporary political scene. None of that will be new to you, but I think it might be helpful to name it out loud. So we'll think about that first. Then I want to say a bit about the first century Jewish purity system. And that too might be either a fresh thing or a reconsideration for you. And then if I'm doing well, somewhere toward the 20 to 25 minute mark, and if you're still with me, I'll see if I can bring those together and offer some sense of what the gospel might have to say, having hopefully established that, yes, the first century does have something to say to the 21st century. So, a little bit about the contemporary political scene. 20th century politics was more or less organised in the West anyway, along a left to right spectrum defined by economic issues. I'm going to generalise, and you can pick me up on the nuances later, but just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to generalise a bit, but I know you'll forgive me for that. Left-wing or reforming political movements were largely centred on the well-being of workers, trade unions, and were championed by social democratic parties seeking better protection for workers and a fairer distribution of wealth. Left-wing reforming politics. Right-wing conservative politics was focused largely on promoting private enterprise, reducing the reach of government, and on promoting the benefits to the economy and to individuals of a free market. But in the last 10 years, and this is telling you something you already know, that left-right spectrum based on economic issues seems to have kind of given way. Political energy now gathers less around economic issues and more around issues of identity. Identity politics. So the two kind of shocks of 2016, Britain's vote to depart the European Union and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, make no sense when viewed through the lens of through that left-right economic spectrum of the 20th century. But they make tremendous sense when you think about the way in which the messaging and the machines of those two elections were all about identity and in particular about immigration. Who is one of us and who is not? Who should be in and who should be kept out? Who are among, dare I say it, the pure, and I'll come back to that, and who are the impure? So both Brexit and the Trump election focused on immigration and communal identity, on borders, on sovereignty, who is in, who is out. And Mr. Trump's wall on the Mexican border and his travel ban against certain Muslim majority countries come to have been emblematic of that turn toward identity politics. I'm reaching for the spectacles because light was good this morning and I'm not seeing so well this evening. Anyway, I recently began to wonder where this phenomena began, identity politics. Really in the 1960s, left-wing politics, again I'm generalising, focused less, as I say, on workers and more on advocacy for marginalised groups. Excellent. Think of the movement for the rights of women, the civil rights movement, the rights of Indigenous people, refugees, gay and lesbian people, the marginalised groups. In response, right-wing or conservative politics began kind of redefining itself, being less focused on the politics of economics and more focused on the politics of national identity. So recently in particular, the right has been seriously redefining itself as the patriots. So to kind of put that another way, the politics from the right has focused on protecting a national identity, which is usually very narrowly defined. And it began doing that in response to what it perceived to be the undermining of that almost sacred national identity by advocacy from the left on behalf of those groups who were never allowed a space in that sacred entity. And if allowed a space, a marginal space. So at the moment, I think it would be fair to say that we're thinking about identity politics because the right wing of politics is making the most of this in the present time. So think of Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, Netanyahu in Israel, Putin in Russia, Trump in the United States. The left of politics probably did its best work, if truth be told, in the 60s and 70s. The rights of women, of the Indigenous, and so on. Now I know that's all a bit abstract, but bringing it closer to home, think of how strange it is that Pauline Hanson attracts support for her very crass and very conservative vision of a white Christian Australia, even from those whose economic vulnerability would lead you to think that they should in fact really be attracted to the left of politics. The workers of Queensland, as it were, are among her supporters. The old economic spectrum is breaking down and the politics of identity is in the ascendance. Think also of how right-wing or conservative politics in Australia has begun to assert itself as the protector of national identity, what I described as a kind of asserting themselves as the patriots, especially within the so-called illegal arrivals debate. We will decide who comes to Australia and the circumstances in which they come, Prime Minister Howard. So Manus and Nauru are battlegrounds, not, tragically, over the profound injustice and human rights issues there, but over identity and borders. Who will we allow to be one of us to take on our identity and who will not? So, lest I sound partisan, I think both left and right of politics are implicated in this downward spiral that we find ourselves in. This politics have fractured into the cycle of resentment over who is more marginalised. Populist leaders identifying themselves with particular groups and stoking these identity grievances. So I suspect that is the genius, and I say knowingly, carefully, evil genius of the Trump political machine, that it knows how to tap into the resentment and the grievances of the identity groups that it is stoking. So Trump has created this kind of contest over who can claim to be truly marginalised. Is it the poor white worker, or is it the poor black or Hispanic? And we're just so vigilant about the encroachment of it here. I don't want to leave this without saying there's been a tradition as back as far as Karl Marx of political struggles being manifest as a manifestation of economic struggles and injustice. Never forget that. So identity politics is in the ascendance, but the politics of economic justice should not be forgotten. I think it's true to say, and if it's not true, it's really close, that the wealthiest 26 people on the planet control the same amount of resources and wealth as the bottom 50% of the global population. And that takes some digesting. But we will nevertheless set that aside and stick with identity politics. So, let me, as I take a glass of sip of water, take us to the 1st century Identity politics as a term sort of arrived in public discourse only in the 1990s. But the prejudice on which it feeds, who is in and who is out, goes deep into history. And this is where I want to try and tie this to an understanding of the gospel and of Jesus' day, and to help us understand the reading that Robert brought to us from Galatians. There is no longer Jew nor Greek, and so on. I'll come back to that. What I want to do is talk to you briefly now about a form of identity politics that scholars call a purity system. So purity systems are found in all cultures, really. I was going to say most cultures, but all cultures. And we don't often, well, I'm sure this congregation does, but we don't as frequently as we should stop and consider how they are operating amongst us all the time. So while I'm speaking about first century Judaism, think about 21st century Christianity, but we could also add into that Islam, Hinduism, all religions operate with this form of purity system. What are they? So at a fairly high level of abstraction, purity systems are a form of classification of people, of groups of people, of places, and of times. They're a kind of purity map that say what belongs and what doesn't. And of those who belong, where they belong and where they don't. Now, among the most obvious expressions of purity systems operating among us today are around sexuality and gender and colour. But putting it into a little bit more detail in the first century, and I'll give you some examples. A purity system is a social system founded in the Levitical codes, I'll come to those, which draw a contrast between who is pure and who is impure, who is clean and who is unclean. And those purity systems into which Jesus is speaking to us took as its starting point Leviticus 19:2. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. What the religious system of the day did to that was turn holiness into a series of purity laws and purity codes that define what holiness is. And they're found in, and here's a bit of bedtime reading that I can't recommend, but nevertheless we need to understand them. Leviticus 11 through to 26, the purity laws and the purity codes. But most important for what I want to say tonight is the way in which those purity codes were applied to people and groups. A person's purity in the first century depended in part on birth. So, for example, the most pure were the line of the priests. The priests have been good at taking care of themselves from day one. Then the Israelites as a nation, followed by Jewish persons who were not Jewish by birth, or we would say converts. But purity also depended not only on birth but on behaviour. So those who behaved in such a way as to be carefully observant of the Levitical codes were the pure, and those non-observant were the impure. But the impure also included certain occupational groups. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that great intrigue is caused around Jericho when Jesus visits the house of Zacchaeus, who is named the chief tax collector of Jericho by Luke. It was Jesus' breach of the purity codes that caused the scandal, because tax collectors were among the impure. It's this purity system which is also the matrix within which we find the social meaning of two phrases that we use a lot in church: the righteous and the sinners. The righteous were those who followed the purity codes. The sinners were those who did not. And we tend to think of sin as a kind of series of misdemeanours, things we shouldn't have done. But in Jesus' day, sin was a bit more of a standing place within society. You were among the sinners if you were among the impure. Not because what we might say we have sinned because we've said something we shouldn't or wounded someone, which is nevertheless something we don't want to do, but it's a different understanding. So some other examples of the way in which first century Jewish purity system classified people: men and women. Being male didn't necessarily guarantee purity, and nor did being female necessarily make someone impure, but the natural processes of menstruation and childbirth were considered impure. So the woman was, in a generalised sense, considered less pure than the male. Able-bodied and disabled-bodied. Think of all the references in the Gospels to lepers and those who were on mats needing to be healed. Physical wholeness was associated with purity, but if you were a disabled person, to use today's phrase, you would be considered impure. Rich and poor. Again, poverty did not necessarily make you impure, but the very fact that you were poor would have made it nearly impossible for you to meet the expectations of the Levitical codes, which included paying taxes to the temple and supporting the priests. And so simply because you couldn't manage that due to poverty, you were impure and in sin. So how are we going? First century purity systems. Who's in, who's out? Who's pure, who's impure? Now, those who are familiar with the Gospels will remember how frequently Jesus is portrayed in serious conflict with the religious authorities and with the religion of his day, particularly those whom the Gospels name as the Pharisees. Now, in truth, we don't know a great deal about the Pharisees, but if we've understood them at all, they were the group that most vociferously advocated for the enforcement of the purity codes. These are the ones who challenged Jesus about healing on the Sabbath, breaking the codes, about eating with prostitutes and tax collectors. How dare he? Break the code. Argue with Jesus over the authority of the law and the authority of the temple, the religious institutions of the day. How dare he break the purity codes? And I say it was a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, and I'll say this too. I think it's impossible to understand the Gospels without understanding the depth of this contest between Jesus and the purity system as it is embodied in the Pharisees. And let me give you one example of how strong was Jesus' criticism. This is Luke chapter 11, verses 43 to 44, and I'll say a brief word about it. Woe to you, Pharisees! For you love the seat of honour in the synagogues and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Woe to you! For you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without realising it. Now, that Jesus names the Pharisees as unmarked graves is easily misunderstood. We can think that he's saying something like, it would be better if you Pharisees were dead. But that's not what he's saying. And understanding this statement correctly reveals how stunning the criticism is. In the Levitical purity codes, death is the source of impurity. Coming into contact with the dead made you impure. This is the key to unlock the parable of the Good Samaritan, which you'll remember is the innocent person on the road to Jericho who's beaten in a ditch, perhaps dead, can't tell. So the Levite walks right by and the priest walks right by, but the Samaritan, who's already impure just by birth, stops and helps. If that person in the ditch is dead, the Levite knows and the priest knows that he would be made impure by touching, helping. So they march straight on to the temple because they don't want to be made impure and be unable to go to temple. The Pharisees, who sought the enforcement of that which is pure and that which is impure, that which is clean and unclean, are here named by Jesus as unmarked graves, over which people innocently walk and thereby make themselves impure without knowing it. Jesus names the Pharisees as impure, the enforcers of the who's in and who's out, the who's clean and who's unclean, the who will we consider part of us and who will we exclude, are the impure. The message of the gospel about the purity systems of all societies, first century Jewish world, 21st century Australia, could not have been more challenging. Listen again to that capstone verse of the Levitical codes from Leviticus 19. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now listen to the contrast that Jesus gives to it in Luke chapter 6, which is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies, Jesus speaking. Do good. Expect nothing in return. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. Wherever we allow Jesus' radical substitution of mercy over holiness to be lost, then we do no more than reinforce the who's in and who's out. Holiness for Jesus is mercy and compassion. So what's the connection to the gospel today? The purity system of first century Jewish world was a social system based on classifying people in and out. Those who are us and those who are them. Not much has changed. Up until the 60s and during the 60s, political concern with identity was largely around the noble cause of actualising the rights of individuals and especially of the marginalised. It is a natural and courageous response to injustice. And it's provoked a response. But both left and right now are caught in this, rather than us and them dynamic, it's become us or them. So I'm sure, like me, the world worries you. And the politics of identity worries you. It's a politics of division. And we need to be vigilant about naming the purity systems among us. Misogyny, racism, homophobia. We must never let those be stoked. And we also need to be honest and say we do play a bit of the politics of identity in the church. And whenever we do that, we do nothing more than replicate the dysfunction we see on the news at night. The church becomes no more than a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. But when we cherish the fact that the church is a community of Christ's disciples, people who seek to follow this astonishing prophet of equality, we are freed from those games. There is no more us or them. There is not even us and them. There is only we in him. Jesus' alternative social vision is centred on mercy, compassion, and he called it the kingdom of God. And we heard, therefore, a special naming of that in Galatians chapter 3. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Only when we've grasped the way in which the purity systems of the first century world were being challenged by Jesus can we understand the radical nature of that vision. It's a message that we do well to reflect upon in the 21st century.